What would you do if the entire town laughed at you for spending your last $5 on a dying horse no one believed would survive the night? On a cold evening in a dusty Wyoming auction yard, a poor cowboy made a choice that looked like pure foolishness, buying a starving pregnant giant mare moments before she was sent to slaughter. But what that mare delivered months later would shock an entire town and turn a forgotten ranch into the center of a miracle no one could explain. So settle in, because this is the story of the $5 horse that changed everything. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Now let's begin. The late afternoon wind rolled through Silver Creek, Wyoming, carrying dust along the narrow dirt road that led to the edge of town. It was the kind of wind people in that part of the country barely noticed anymore. Dry, restless, and full of the faint smell of prairie grass baked under a relentless sun. The sky stretched wide and pale above the valley, washed in a thin yellow light that settled over weather-faded wooden roofs and crooked fence posts that had stood through too many seasons. At the far end of town sat the old horse auction yard, a place where the fate of animals, and sometimes the fate of men, changed hands in the span of a few shouted numbers. The yard was separated from the main street by a stretch of trampled dirt scattered with wagon ruts, dried straw, and the unmistakable smell of horses that had traveled far and hard. The sounds of the auction drifted across the yard in waves. The steady crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed from the wooden platform near the main barn, rising and falling over the murmur of voices, the restless stamping of hooves, and the rough laughter of cowboys and ranchers gathered around the pens. In Silver Creek, a place like this moved quickly. Good horses were admired, bid on, and led away within minutes. The weak ones, the sick ones, or the ones nobody wanted, those were forgotten just as quickly. Into that restless crowd walked Ethan Carter. He didn't look like most of the men gathered there that afternoon. His coat had faded to a dull brown from years of sun and wind. The brim of his old hat curved unevenly from too many storms. His boots were scuffed and worn thin at the heels, the leather creased from long miles on horseback. Ethan moved quietly through the crowd, the way a man does when he has no business drawing attention to himself. He wasn't there to buy a horse. Truth was, Ethan didn't have the money for something like that. He had come to the auction yard for a far more practical reason. Under one arm, he carried an old leather saddle. It had once been part of a better life. Years ago, Ethan's family had owned a small ranch out on the prairie west of town. It wasn't much compared to the big spreads owned by wealthy ranchers, but it had been enough. Enough land to graze a handful of horses. Enough water to keep the grass alive most summers. Enough pride to make a man feel like he belonged somewhere. But the prairie had changed. The rain stopped coming like they used to. The grass turned brittle and thin. One dry season followed another, and the bank's patience ran out long before the clouds ever returned. By the time the dust settled, the ranch was gone. All Ethan had managed to hold on to was a small patch of land on the far edge of the property, an old wooden barn that leaned slightly to one side, and one aging horse that had carried him through the hardest years of his life. That horse still needed feed. And the saddle in Ethan's hands was one of the last things he had left to trade. He pushed through the crowd and eventually found a man willing to buy it, though the price offered was far lower than the saddle was worth. Ethan didn't argue. Arguing required energy he didn't have. When the money changed hands, the weight in his pocket felt small and uncertain. Just a few crumpled bills. Enough, hopefully, to buy hay for another week. With his business done, Ethan turned away from the main auction ring. He didn't linger to watch the bidding wars that broke out over the best horses in the yard. He knew better than to stand too close to something he couldn't afford. As he walked past the row of pens, he caught glimpses of strong ranch horses, tossing their heads and pawing the dirt. Buyers leaned over the rails, inspecting legs, teeth, and shoulders, talking quickly in low voices before raising their hands to bid. Money moved fast in places like this. Ethan kept walking. After a while, he drifted toward the back of the yard, almost without realizing it. The noise from the auctioneer faded behind him, replaced by a quieter part of the auction grounds where the less desirable animals were kept. The pens back there were darker, the boards older, the air heavier with neglect. These were the animals that hadn't caught anyone's eye, the ones nobody fought over. Some were thin, some were old. Some simply looked tired in a way that made buyers lose interest before they ever stepped close. Ethan walked slowly along the row, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. Then he stopped. In the far corner of one pen stood a horse so large that for a moment it didn't even seem real. It was a Shire mare towering over the rails of the pen, her frame massive, even in her weakened condition. The first thing Ethan noticed was her sheer size. Even standing still, she dwarfed the other horses nearby. But the second thing he noticed was worse. The mare was starving. Her ribs pressed sharply beneath her dark coat, each bone visible under skin stretched far too tight. The once thick black hair along her neck hung in tangled clumps, stiff with dried mud and dust. Her legs trembled slightly under the weight of her body. And then there was her belly. It was enormous. Not just the roundness of a normal pregnancy, but something heavier, fuller, almost unnatural in the way it pulled downward against her thin frame. The mare stood with her head low, breathing slowly as though every breath required careful effort. For a moment, Ethan simply stared. There was something deeply unsettling about the contrast. The mare's frame suggested a horse that had once been powerful, maybe even magnificent. But what stood before him now looked like the fading shadow of that strength. A creature that had once been valuable, now left to wait quietly for the end. Ethan stepped closer to the rail. The mare didn't move away. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, her hooves scraping softly across the dirt. The movement seemed to cost her more effort than it should have. Ethan noticed the small details as he looked closer, scratches along her flank where the hair had been rubbed away. Dust caught in the folds of her mane, and the way her belly sagged lower than any pregnant mare he had ever seen. "She ain't worth looking at." The voice came from behind him. Ethan turned to see one of the auction yard workers approaching a young man with tired eyes and a hat pushed too far back on his head. The man leaned against the fence rail and nodded toward the mare. "Too weak," he said casually. "Too far along. Nobody wants that kind of trouble." Ethan kept his eyes on the horse. How much, he asked quietly. The worker gave a short laugh. "You serious?" Ethan didn't answer. The man shrugged. "Kill buyer already offered $5, he said. "She'll go out with the cull shipment after the sale." He gestured toward the mare. "That horse won't last the week." Ethan ran a hand along the rough wooden rail. The worker continued talking almost as if explaining the obvious. $5 is already more mercy than she's likely to get." Ethan looked down at the ground for a moment. Then he stepped closer to the pen. The mare lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met his. They were dark and hollow with exhaustion, and the skin around them drawn tight from hunger and long neglect. But they weren't empty. In those eyes, Ethan saw something he recognized immediately: pain, weariness, and something else. A quiet refusal to collapse completely. It was the same stubbornness he had seen in his father years ago, long after the drought had taken the ranch. The same stubbornness Ethan had felt in himself when the bank men came with their papers. For a long moment, the two simply looked at one another. A dying horse, and a cowboy who had almost nothing left. Behind him, someone laughed loudly at another auction pen. The noise felt distant and unimportant. Ethan reached into his pocket. The bills there felt thin in his hand. He knew exactly how foolish this was. He needed that money for feed, for survival. The mare might die tomorrow. But the thought of walking away from those eyes felt worse than losing the last dollars he had. He turned back toward the worker. $5, Ethan asked. The man raised an eyebrow. You really want her? Ethan nodded once. Before he could change his mind, he pulled the bills from his pocket and handed them over. The worker shook his head with a quiet chuckle. Well, he muttered, guess she's yours. A few cowboys leaning against a nearby fence had been watching the exchange. When they realized what had just happened, they burst out laughing. You just bought yourself a corpse, one of them called. That horse won't make it to Sunday, another said. Only a fool drags trouble like that home. Ethan didn't respond. He rested one hand on the rail and looked at the mare again. If she heard the laughter, she gave no sign. After a moment, a familiar voice spoke beside him. Ethan. He turned to see Tom Alvarez walking up through the yard. Tom had known Ethan back when the Carter Ranch still had cattle grazing the fields. The years had treated Tom a little better, though the lines around his eyes suggested life hadn't been easy for him either. Tom glanced at the mare and then back at Ethan. You bought that horse? Ethan nodded. Tom studied the mare for a long moment. She ain't walking far, he said finally. No, Ethan replied. Tom scratched the back of his neck. Well, he sighed, good thing I brought the trailer. It took the better part of an hour to coax the massive mare onto the trailer. She was weak, confused, and frightened, but Ethan stayed near her head the entire time, speaking softly. Easy now, he murmured. Just one step. Eventually, she climbed aboard. When the trailer door closed behind her, the noise of the auction yard faded as Tom's truck rolled away down the dusty road. The prairie stretched wide around them as they drove. Cold wind swept across the fields, bending the dry grass flat against the earth. Broken fence lines ran along the roadside, and distant hills faded into the gray horizon. Neither man spoke much during the drive. When they finally reached Ethan's land, the fading sunlight revealed what remained of the old Carter Ranch. The barn leaned slightly to one side. The fences sagged. The earth around the house had cracked from too many dry seasons. What had once been a hopeful place now looked tired and forgotten. But it was still home. Tom backed the trailer up to the barn while Ethan opened the gate. Together, they guided the mare down the ramp and into the cleanest stall Ethan could offer. He spread fresh straw across the floor and filled a bucket with water. The mare stood quietly in the dim light of the barn, breathing slowly. When Tom finally climbed back into his truck and drove away, the ranch fell silent. Ethan stood alone in the stall with the horse. For a long time, he simply watched her. Then he spoke softly. "Grace," he said. The name felt right the moment it left his lips. Not because she was beautiful, not because she was strong, but because even in her broken state, there was something about her that felt like a small piece of grace the world had not completely taken away. Will the mare survive long enough to safely bring her foals into the world? Or are these simply the last quiet days of her life after years of suffering? Do you think Ethan made a miracle decision or a heartbreaking mistake? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we move into the most incredible part of this story. The first night after Grace arrived at the ranch, the wind began to rise. Cold Wyoming air slipped through the cracks of the old barn walls, whistling through loose boards and rattling the thin metal hinges of the stall doors. Outside, the prairie stretched into darkness, the tall grass bending under long, restless gusts that carried the smell of dry earth and distant snow. Ethan Carter couldn't sleep. Every time he lay down in the small house, his mind drifted back to the mare standing alone in the barn. After a few minutes of staring at the ceiling, he finally grabbed the oil lantern and stepped back outside. The barn door creaked open slowly. Inside, the soft yellow light of the lantern flickered against wooden beams and drifting dust. The smell of straw and horse sweat filled the air. Grace lay on her side in the stall where Ethan had left her, her massive body resting on the fresh straw he had spread earlier that evening. Even lying down, she looked enormous, her dark frame filling nearly the entire stall. Her breathing was heavy but steady. Ethan stood quietly by the gate and watched. For a while, he simply listened. The slow rhythm of the mare's breathing, the faint rustle of straw as she shifted her weight, the wind tapping gently against the barn walls. After several minutes, Grace stirred and slowly pushed herself upright. The effort seemed enormous. Her legs trembled slightly before finally locking beneath her weight. Ethan raised the lantern higher, and that was when he noticed it more clearly than before. Her belly. Of course, he had seen it earlier at the auction yard, but in the quiet of the barn, with nothing else to distract him, the size of it felt different. He had grown up around horses. His father had owned several work horses and a few shires years ago, and Ethan knew the shape of a pregnant mare well enough. This wasn't normal. Grace's lower belly sagged far lower than it should have. It looked stretched and heavy in a way that made Ethan uneasy just looking at it. When she shifted her weight from one leg to the other, her entire body seemed to brace against the strain. "Easy there," Ethan murmured softly. Grace lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes turning toward him. Even in the dim light, he could see the exhaustion in them. But he could also see something else. She was still trying. That thought followed him back into the house later that night. He lay awake for hours before finally making up his mind. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the prairie, Ethan saddled his old horse and rode toward Silver Creek. Frost covered the grass along the road, and thin clouds hung low over the distant hills. His breath drifted into the air as he rode, urging the tired horse forward with quiet determination. He stopped in front of a small wooden building near the edge of town. A faded sign hung above the door. Laura Bennett, D.V. Meathen, tied his horse to the hitching post and knocked. A moment later, the door opened. "Doctor, Laura Bennett stood there in a thick wool coat, her hair pulled back, and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. She studied Ethan for a moment. "You're out early," she said. "I need you to look at a horse." Ethan replied. That alone didn't surprise her. Ranchers came with injured animals all the time. But when Ethan began explaining the situation, her expression changed. "You bought a Shire mare at the auction yard," she said, "for $5. Dr. Bennett folded her arms. That usually means someone already decided the horse wasn't worth saving. "She's pregnant," Ethan said quietly. Dr. Bennett raised an eyebrow. "How far along close?" Ethan hesitated before adding the last detail. "And her belly looks wrong." That was enough to change the veterinarian's tone. Within half an hour, she had gathered her medical bag and climbed into her truck. They drove out to Ethan's ranch under a sky that was growing colder by the minute. Neither of them spoke much during the ride. Ethan kept replaying the image of Grace standing in the dim barn light the night before. When they arrived, Dr. Bennett stepped into the barn and stopped just inside the doorway. Her eyes moved slowly across the stall. Grace stood quietly in the straw, her massive frame silhouetted against the barn wall. The veterinarian's expression shifted instantly. "Well," she muttered under her breath. "That's not good." She approached the mare slowly, her movements calm and practiced. Grace watched her carefully, but didn't move away. Dr. Bennett circled the horse once, then again. Her hand pressed gently against the mare's ribs. "You see this?" she said quietly to Ethan. Ethan nodded. Grace's ribs were visible beneath her dark coat. "She's severely malnourished," Dr. Bennett continued. "Hasn't been fed properly in months." She examined the mare's legs next. "They're shaking because she's carrying too much weight for her condition." Grace shifted her stance slightly, her hooves scraping softly across the straw. Dr. Bennett leaned closer, checking her gums and breathing. "Dehydrated," she said. Then she moved to the mare's belly. Her hands pressed carefully along the swollen shape while she listened closely to the sounds inside. After a long moment, she straightened slowly. Ethan could already tell the news wasn't going to be good. "She's very late in her pregnancy," Dr. Bennett said. "How late?" Ethan asked. "Soon." That word hung in the air. Dr. Bennett ran her hand along Grace's flank again, her brow tightening slightly. "Something else is wrong," she said. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "What?" The veterinarian hesitated. "My guess," she said carefully, "is twins." Ethan blinked. "Twins," Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. "Twin pregnancies in horses are rare," she explained, "and they're dangerous." How dangerous? Dr. Bennett didn't soften the answer. Most of the time, neither foal survives. She glanced back at Grace. And the mare often doesn't either. The barn fell silent. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle heavily around him. Dr. Bennett finished her examination and then stepped outside the stall. "Come here a second," she said. Ethan followed her into the cold air just outside the barn. The wind tugged at their coats as she spoke. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said quietly. "That mare might not make it to the birth." Ethan swallowed. "And if she does," Dr. Bennett looked back toward the stall. "If there are 2 foals inside her," she said, "the chances of losing all 3 are very real." Ethan stared down at the frozen dirt beneath his boots. Dr. Bennett continued. She's weak, too weak for a difficult delivery. And if it's twins, that delivery will be difficult. For a long time, Ethan didn't say anything. Finally, Dr. Bennett asked the question that had been waiting in the air. "You sure you want to do this?" Ethan looked back toward the barn. Grace stood quietly inside the stall, her massive body outlined by the soft glow of the lantern. She hadn't collapsed. She hadn't given up. Ethan shook his head slowly. "I didn't pull her out of that auction yard just to watch her die alone," he said. Dr. Bennett studied his face for a moment. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said. "Then we try." That afternoon, she wrote out careful feeding instructions. "Start slow," she said. "Small portions. Warm water only. And watch for signs of distress." Before leaving, she added one last instruction. "You'll need to check on her constantly." Ethan gave a quiet laugh. "I was planning on that anyway." That evening, he carried an old folding cot from the house into the barn. He placed it against the far wall of the stall close enough that he could hear Grace breathing during the night. Around the cot, he arranged a lantern, a thick blanket, a bucket of water, and the notes Dr. Bennett had written for him. From that moment on, the barn became his home. The days that followed moved slowly. Ethan fed Grace carefully, exactly as the veterinarian instructed. Small bundles of soft hay, measured portions of grain, mineral supplements mixed into warm mash. At first, the mare barely touched the food. There were long hours when Ethan stood by the stall wondering if she would eat at all. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change. One morning she finished an entire bucket. Another day she drank deeply from the water trough. Her eyes began to brighten. Her legs stopped trembling quite as much. To anyone else, the improvements might have seemed small. But to Ethan, they felt enormous. He brushed the dirt and tangles from her coat every evening. Grace stood quietly during those moments, her head lowering slightly as the brush passed over her back. Sometimes Ethan talked while he worked. "Easy girl," he would say. "One more day. Just keep standing." Eventually, those quiet words turned into longer conversations. He told her about the ranch that used to belong to his family, about the summers when the grass grew tall and the horses ran freely across the fields, about the drought that came later, and the day the bankmen took the land. Grace listened with slow, patient eyes. Weeks passed. Soon the people of Silver Creek began hearing about the mare. At first the story spread as a joke. That fool Carter bought a dying horse for $5. But when the mare didn't die, curiosity replaced laughter. Neighbors began stopping by the ranch. Some brought small gifts, a sack of grain, a bale of hay. Others simply stood by the fence and watched. Tom Alvarez visited, often helping repair broken rails and patch holes in the barn roof. The ranch no longer felt quite so empty. Then one cold afternoon, Dr. Bennett returned for another examination. Grace stood stronger now, her coat cleaner and her eyes clearer. But her belly, it had grown even larger. The veterinarian listened carefully with her stethoscope. Once, then again. Her brow tightened. Ethan noticed the silence immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Dr. Bennett didn't answer right away. She moved the stethoscope to a different spot and listened again. The barn grew quiet. Finally, she lowered the instrument slowly and looked at Ethan. "There's something I didn't expect," she said. What Dr. Bennett exhaled slowly. I hear 3 heartbeats. Ethan blinked. I'm sorry. What 3? The word landed like a hammer. Ethan leaned against the stall rail. 3 foals. Inside one starving mare. Dr. Bennett shook her head slightly. I've never seen it end well, she admitted. If she tries to deliver all 3. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Outside, winter winds began sweeping down from the mountains. Snow soon covered the prairie. Ethan reinforced the barn walls and piled extra straw inside the stall. Each night, he sat quietly beside the cot, watching Grace under the dim lantern light. He didn't know whether he was preparing for a miracle or a tragedy. But one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving her to face it alone. Night fell quickly over the Wyoming prairie. One moment, the sky above Silver Creek still carried the last dull glow of evening, and the next, it was swallowed by a wall of wind and snow. The storm rolled down from the mountains without warning, dragging curtains of white across the open land until the horizon disappeared entirely. The wind screamed across Ethan Carter's ranch like a living thing. Snow slammed against the barn walls and rattled the loose wooden boards so hard, the entire structure seemed to shudder with each gust. The old fences groaned under the pressure of the storm, and the narrow dirt road leading to the ranch vanished beneath a growing blanket of white. Inside the barn, a single lantern cast a faint circle of warm yellow light. Grace stood quietly in her stall, but something about her was different. Ethan had noticed it earlier that afternoon. She had been standing unusually still, her head lowered, shifting her weight slowly from one leg to the other. Every so often she turned her head toward her flank, as if listening to something happening deep inside her body. Now, as the blizzard tightened its grip around the ranch, the tension inside the barn seemed to mirror the storm outside. Ethan sat on the edge of the folding cot in the corner of the stall, watching her carefully. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. And then Grace breathed sharply. The sound jolted Ethan upright. He grabbed the lantern and stepped closer. Grace's sides were moving faster now. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared along her neck and shoulders, even though the barn air was cold enough to frost the wooden beams above them. Her tail lifted slightly, then dropped again. She pawed once at the straw, then again. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Not yet, he whispered quietly. But he knew. Every sign Dr. Laura Bennett had warned him about was unfolding right in front of him. Grace was going into labor. Ethan rushed into the small house beside the barn, his hands shaking as he grabbed the phone. The wind battered the walls outside while he dialed the veterinarian's number. Dr. Bennett answered after the second ring. Laura Bennett. It's Ethan, he said quickly. Grace, she's starting. He heard her inhale sharply. All right, she replied. I'm coming. I'll bring Daniel with me. Daniel Brooks was the young veterinary student who had been assisting her around Silver Creek for the past few months. But listen to me, she added. This storm's slowing everything down. It might take us a little longer to reach you. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Just get here. He hung up and ran back to the barn. Grace had begun to tremble. He stepped beside her and rested one hand against her neck. Easy, girl, he murmured. I'm right here. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Word spread quickly through the small community of Silver Creek. Dr. Bennett had made a few calls on her way out of town, asking for help in case the situation turned worse. before long headlights began appearing through the snow. One truck, then another. People arrived wrapped in thick coats and wool hats, carrying lanterns and flashlights. They didn't storm into the barn or crowd around the stall. Instead, they gathered quietly outside beneath the overhang of the barn roof. Tom Alvarez was the first to arrive. Behind him came two ranchers who had visited the Mare before. A pair of women from town carried thermoses of hot coffee and bundles of clean towels. No one spoke loudly. The wind swallowed most of their words anyway. They all stood in the snow watching the closed barn door and waiting. Inside the stall, Grace's contractions were growing stronger. Her entire body tensed with each wave of pain. Her legs trembled violently as she struggled to keep her balance. Ethan stayed beside her head, one hand gripping the loose lead rope while the other stroked her neck. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "You hold on now." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then the barn door burst open. Dr. Bennett and Daniel rushed inside, their coats covered in snow. "Where is she?" the veterinarian asked quickly. "Right here," Ethan said. Dr. Bennett stepped into the stall and immediately began examining the mare. Her expression tightened. "She's exhausted," she muttered. Daniel set down the medical bag and began preparing towels and equipment. Outside, the wind hammered against the barn like a drum. Inside, the air grew thick with tension. Grace groaned deeply in her throat as another contraction struck. "Here we go," Dr. Bennett said quietly. She knelt beside the mare and watched carefully. Ethan stepped back half a pace, but his eyes never left Grace. The first clear sign appeared moments later. "Foal coming," Dr. Bennett said. Grace gave a long, low cry as her body pushed with everything it had left. And then suddenly, the first foal slipped onto the straw. For a moment, no one moved. The tiny body lay still. Then the chest twitched. The foal lifted its head weakly and sucked in its first breath. A thin, fragile cry filled the stall. Daniel let out a stunned laugh. Dr. Bennett exhaled heavily. Ethan simply stared. The foal was small and delicate, its legs long and thin beneath a coat still slick from birth. But it was alive. Ethan slowly knelt beside the newborn. Snow battered the barn walls outside, but inside that stall the world seemed to pause. He placed his hand gently against the foal's neck. "Hope," he whispered. The name came to him instantly. Because after weeks of fear, that tiny living creature felt like the first real sign that something good might still exist in the world. Dr. Bennett gave him a brief glance. But the moment of relief didn't last long. Grace suddenly tensed again. Her muscles tightened violently, and her breathing became ragged. "She's not done," Dr. Bennett said sharply. Daniel quickly moved Hope to a dry patch of straw and wrapped a towel around the small body to keep it warm. Another contraction hit. Grace staggered slightly. Ethan grabbed the lead rope. "You're doing fine," he said softly. "Just keep going." The second labor was harder. Grace was weaker now. Each push seemed to drain more strength from her massive body. Finally, the second foal emerged. But when it landed on the straw, it didn't move. The stall went silent. The foal lay completely still. No breath, no sound. Ethan stared at the tiny body in disbelief. Dr. Bennett dropped to her knees immediately. Daniel towels. She cleared the foal's airway and began rubbing its chest vigorously. "Come on," she muttered. Nothing happened. The seconds stretched painfully long. Outside the barn, the people waiting in the snow fell completely silent. Ethan knelt beside the veterinarian, his hands clenched so tightly they hurt. Grace turned her head weakly toward the foal, her dark eyes filled with something close to fear. Dr. Bennett kept working. "Come on, little one," she said quietly. Still nothing. Ethan felt a wave of helplessness wash through him. After everything Grace had endured, it couldn't end like this. Dr. Bennett changed her grip and pressed harder against the foal's chest. Another second passed, then the foal twitched. A faint gasp escaped its throat. Daniel inhaled sharply. The foal's chest rose, then fell, then rose again. It was breathing. Daniel sagged against the stall wall. Ethan bent forward, covering his face with one hand, as emotion rushed through him. Dr. Bennett leaned back with a tired smile. "Well," she said softly, "that's one stubborn little fighter." When the foal's breathing steadied, Ethan knelt beside it. "Faith," he said quietly, because at that moment, belief felt like the only thing that had pulled the foal back from the edge. For a brief moment, the stall relaxed. 2 foals, both alive. Grace stood, trembling, her head hanging low. Everyone thought the worst was over. But then Grace cried out again. Dr. Bennett froze. She quickly examined the mare again. Her eyes widened. "There's another one." Ethan stared at her. "Another?" She nodded slowly. "She's carrying 3. The words hit the stall like thunder. Grace barely had the strength left to stand, and yet her body began pushing again. Ethan pressed his forehead gently against her neck. "You're almost there," he whispered. "You hear me." Outside, the storm howled across the prairie. Inside the barn, every person present held their breath. Grace gathered the last of her strength. One final contraction tore through her body, and then the 3rd foal slid onto the straw. This one was different immediately. Larger, stronger. A bright white star marked its forehead. The foal lifted its head and inhaled deeply before letting out a sharp cry that echoed through the stall. Daniel stared in amazement. Dr. Bennett stood motionless for a moment, her professional composure finally slipping. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes. The foal kicked its legs energetically, already fighting to stand. "Joy," Ethan said quietly, because after everything that had happened that night, there was no other word for it. Dr. Bennett carefully checked each newborn. Then she turned to Ethan with a look of disbelief. "All 3 are alive," she said. "And Grace too." The mare stood weakly, but steady enough. She lowered her head toward the foals, breathing softly as they wriggled in the straw. Ethan rested his hand gently against her neck. "You did it, girl," he whispered. Outside, the storm slowly began to fade. Morning light crept across the horizon. When the barn doors opened, the waiting townspeople stepped inside. They saw 3 foals and the exhausted mare who had somehow survived the impossible. The news spread across Silver Creek by sunrise. Within hours, the entire town was talking about the $5 mare who had given birth to 3 living foals during the worst blizzard of the winter. And before long, the people of Silver Creek had given the foals a name. They called them the Miracle Sisters. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the Wyoming prairie. The heavy snow that had buried the land around Silver Creek for weeks began to melt beneath the pale warmth of early spring sunlight. Day by day, patches of dry grass pushed through the white crust, revealing the familiar open fields that stretched for miles beyond Ethan Carter's ranch. The barn that had once held a desperate battle for survival now felt alive with movement. 3 small foals stumbled through the straw-covered paddock behind the barn, their long legs still unsure, but growing stronger with every passing day. Hope was always the first to try something new. She would lift her head, flick her ears forward, and take a few bold steps before wobbling awkwardly sideways and bumping into her sisters. Faith moved more carefully, watching everything around her with wide, curious eyes, before attempting the same slow steps. Joy, the largest of the 3, already showed signs of strength that surprised everyone who visited. The foals spent their mornings learning how to stand, walk, and occasionally run in short, clumsy bursts across the pasture. Nearby, Grace watched them closely. The great Shire mare had recovered slowly after the brutal night of the blizzard. Her ribs were still faintly visible beneath her dark coat, but her strength had returned enough for her to move comfortably through the paddock and keep watch over her daughters. Every so often she would lower her head and nudge one of the foals, gently guiding them back toward her when they wandered too far. The people of Silver Creek still visited often. Word of the miracle birth had traveled far beyond in the small town. Ranchers from neighboring valleys stopped by out of curiosity. Families from towns across the hills drove out along the dirt road just to see the 3 famous foals that had survived the impossible. Many of them leaned against the fence, quietly watching the small herd. Children laughed whenever one of the foals attempted to gallop and tripped over its own legs. Older ranchers simply shook their heads in disbelief. "I still don't know how that mare survived," one man muttered. But Ethan Carter lived his life much the same as before. He woke early, fed the horses, repaired fences, carried hay from the barn to the paddock. The miracle that had taken place during the storm had changed many things, but Ethan himself had not become a different man. He still worked the ranch with the same quiet determination he had shown since the day he spent his last $5 at the auction yard. What Ethan didn't know was that the miracle had attracted attention far beyond Silver Creek. One cool spring morning, he was repairing a broken section of fence near the front of the ranch when he heard the sound of an unfamiliar engine approaching along the dirt road. Ethan straightened slowly and wiped the dust from his hands. A black luxury car rolled carefully down the narrow path toward the barn. It looked completely out of place among the weathered trucks and horse trailers usually seen in Silver Creek. Its polished body reflected the morning sunlight like a mirror. The car stopped near the gate. A tall man stepped out. He wore a long, dark coat and polished leather shoes that clearly had never stepped in ranch mud before. The man looked around the property with quiet interest before approaching the fence. "Morning," he said. Ethan nodded. "Morning. My name is William Harrington." The name didn't mean anything to Ethan. But the moment Harrington looked toward the pasture behind the barn, his entire expression changed. Grace stood there in the grass, with the 3 foals grazing nearby. Harrington stopped walking. For several seconds, he didn't speak at all. He simply stared. Then he took a slow step closer to the fence. "Well, I'll be," he murmured under his breath. Ethan noticed the strange reaction. "You know that horse?" he asked. Harrington didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the mare carefully. Her powerful frame, the shape of her shoulders, the faint white marking along the inside of her left leg. Finally, he turned back to Ethan. "That Harrington said slowly is not just any Shire mare." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That horse Harrington," continued, "is Graceful Majesty." The name meant nothing to Ethan, but the tone in Harrington's voice made it sound important. "I think you've got the wrong horse," Ethan replied. "I bought her at the Silver Creek auction yard for $5. Harrington shook his head slightly. "No," he said quietly. "You didn't buy a dying mare. You bought one of the most valuable Shire bloodlines in North America." Ethan stared at him. Harrington rested his arms on the fence and continued watching Grace. "Years ago, he said Graceful Majesty was part of my breeding program in Colorado. She was one of the strongest foundation mares we had." Harrington explained that Graceful Majesty carried an extremely rare European Shire bloodline that had been carefully preserved through generations of selective breeding. "She was meant to help rebuild the Shire population in this country," Harrington said. But things changed. Several partner ranches had been involved in the breeding program. A financial dispute between two of the owners caused the entire operation to collapse. Horses were sold off quickly to cover debts. Graceful Majesty was one of them. "She disappeared into the horse trade," Harrington said quietly. "From there, she passed through several different owners. Each time she was sold, the conditions grew worse. Eventually, she ended up with people who didn't care about bloodlines or breeding potential. To them, she was simply a large animal capable of pulling heavy loads. They worked her until her strength began to fade. And when she could no longer perform the labor they wanted, they sold her along with a group of unwanted horses. The same group Ethan had seen at the auction yard in Silver Creek." Harrington sighed softly. "I spent years trying to track her down," he said. "But by the time I found records pointing toward Wyoming," he gestured toward the pasture, "you had already saved her." Harrington reached into the leather briefcase he had carried from the car. Inside were several carefully preserved documents. He handed them to Ethan. "These are her registry papers." Ethan studied the pages slowly. The documents listed the full registered name, Graceful Majesty. They showed generations of Shire champions and foundation mares in her bloodline. For the first time, Ethan realized that the starving horse he had rescued from slaughter carried a history far larger than anything he had imagined. Harrington looked back toward the three foals. "They're her daughters?" he asked. Ethan nodded. Hope trotted clumsily past the fence, while Joy chased after her. Faith followed a moment later. Harrington watched them with open fascination. "If Grace truly is Graceful Majesty," he said, "then those three foals are incredibly valuable." Ethan folded the papers slowly. How valuable, Harrington spoke calmly. "In the breeding world, rare Shire bloodlines like hers are nearly impossible to find." He gestured toward the foals. Each of those fillies could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ethan blinked. "And together..." Harrington paused. "They could be worth several million." The words hung quietly in the air between them. But Ethan didn't look excited. He simply glanced back toward the pasture where the three young horses played beneath the open sky. Harrington studied him carefully. "I would like to make you an offer," he said. "I could purchase Grace and the foals outright. Or we could arrange a breeding partnership. You would never have to worry about money again." For many people, the decision would have taken less than a second. But Ethan didn't hesitate long. He shook his head. I didn't save Grace so someone else could sell her again. Harrington raised an eyebrow. They're not property to me, Ethan said quietly. They're family. For a moment, Harrington said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. I respect that. He returned the papers to his briefcase. But the story of graceful majesty did not stay secret for long. Within weeks, rumors spread across the ranching communities surrounding Silver Creek. People began talking about the 3 miracle foals worth a fortune, and where there was value, there was always danger. One quiet night, several weeks later, 2 strangers approached the ranch under the cover of darkness. They slipped through a broken section of the fence behind the barn and moved toward the paddock, carrying ropes and flashlights. Their target was obvious: 3 valuable foals. What they hadn't expected was Grace. The massive mare stepped forward the moment she sensed them. She positioned herself directly between the men and the foals. Then she released a loud, powerful neigh that echoed across the silent prairie. Inside the small house, Ethan woke instantly. He grabbed the old shotgun that had once belonged to his father and ran outside. The porch light snapped on. The intruders froze. When they saw the gun and heard Ethan chamber a round, they quickly retreated toward their truck parked along the road. Within seconds, they disappeared into the darkness. Grace remained standing in front of the foals, her ears pinned forward and her body tense. Ethan walked slowly toward her. It's all right, he said softly. You scared them off. But the incident changed something in his mind. Ethan realized the ranch could no longer remain just a quiet, forgotten place. If the horses truly carried the value Harrington described, then the land needed to become something stronger, safer. Within months, he began rebuilding the ranch. New fences were installed, additional stalls were built. The old barn was repaired and expanded. Ethan gave the place a new name: Grace's Haven. It wasn't just a ranch anymore. It became a sanctuary for horses that had been abandoned, injured, or mistreated across the region. Not long after the transformation began, a man named Luke Dawson arrived at the ranch. Luke was a military veteran searching for a quiet place to rebuild his life. He quickly became Ethan's partner in caring for the growing number of rescued horses. Together, they worked the land-repaired structures and cared for animals that might otherwise have been lost. Before long, the once-forgotten ranch had become a place people traveled to see. Families from nearby towns brought their children to meet the famous Miracle Sisters. Cars lined the dirt road on weekends. Laughter replaced the lonely silence that had once filled the property. Hope, faith, and joy grew quickly. Their long, powerful legs carried them across the open pasture in graceful runs that hinted at the extraordinary bloodline Harrington had described. Grace often stood near the fence watching them. Her daughters would occasionally gallop back to her, brushing against her sides before racing off again. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Wyoming prairie, Ethan leaned against the wooden fence and watched the 3 young horses running across the golden grass. Grace stood nearby, her dark silhouette framed by the fading light. Ethan thought back to the dusty auction yard in Silver Creek, the moment he had pulled $5 from his pocket. At the time, he believed he was only saving one dying horse. Now he understood something very different. That single decision had changed everything, not only his life, but Grace's life, her daughters' lives, and the future of a ranch that now stood proudly under a new name, Grace's Haven. About a year after the night the blizzard brought 3 impossible foals into the world. Grace's Haven no longer looked like the broken ranch where Ethan Carter had once stood with almost nothing left to lose. The place had changed in ways even Ethan sometimes struggled to believe. The old barn had been expanded with 2 new wings. Fresh timber framed the larger stalls, and strong new fencing stretched across the property, where crooked rails and broken posts had once leaned toward collapse. A second paddock had been built near the lower meadow, and a long water trough ran beside it, fed by a line Luke Dawson had helped lay with his own hands. Luke had become more than just extra help. He was now the steady heartbeat of the place, the man everyone looked for when a horse needed calming, when a fence needed fixing, or when a frightened rescue had to be coaxed gently from a trailer. Ethan still called him the kid sometimes, even though Luke had already proven himself a man in every way that mattered. By then, nearly 10 abandoned horses from neighboring ranches had found their way to Grace's Haven. Some had come thin and scarred. Some had arrived limping. Some had simply been old, used up, and no longer wanted. But here they were, fed, treated, and given space to heal. And hope, faith, and joy were no longer awkward little miracles wobbling on uncertain legs. They had grown tall and strong, nearly the size of full mares now, with long, powerful bodies and the unmistakable grace of their bloodline. When they ran across the pasture together, even the oldest ranchers in Silver Creek stopped talking to watch. People in town had started calling Grace's Haven something new. The horse sanctuary of the valley? Ethan never asked for a name like that. But the place had become exactly that. Then summer came, and with it came a heat Wyoming rarely showed so early or so fiercely. By the middle of June, the grass across the prairie had already turned a deeper yellow than it should have. The earth cracked in places. Wind swept over the hills carrying dust instead of moisture. And every afternoon, the sky seemed to harden into a pale white glare. Luke noticed it before most people did. One evening, as he and Ethan stood near the paddock watching the horses graze, Luke bent to snap a handful of grass between his fingers. It broke with a dry, brittle sound. "This land's ready to burn," he said quietly. Ethan looked over the pasture. The truth was written everywhere. Dry brush had gathered along the fence lines. Dead grass clung in patches beneath the barn walls. Even the edges of the trail leading down to the creek had become crisp underfoot. So they worked. For days, Ethan and Luke cut and cleared brush around the ranch. They hauled away dry weeds, raked the ground bare near the barn, and stacked water barrels where they could reach them quickly. Luke made fire breaks where he could, and Ethan checked the roof twice, then a third time, as if worry alone might stop what nature intended to do. But nature does not bargain with worry. One night, close to midnight, a storm rolled over Silver Creek. It came fast, as mountain storms often did in summer, without much rain, but with a violence that split the sky. Thunder moved over the prairie like heavy artillery, and lightning flashed across the horizon in sharp white veins. Ethan was half asleep when he heard the first crack of thunder directly overhead. A second later came another sound. Luke shouting. Ethan bolted upright in bed and rushed to the porch. Beyond the barn toward the rear field, an orange light flickered low against the darkness. For one impossible second, it looked almost beautiful. Then the wind shifted and the truth became clear. Fire. A bolt of lightning had struck the dry grass on the rise behind the ranch, and the flames were already spreading fast through the field. The tall, dead grass fed them greedily. The wind pushed them forward in long, leaping lines, sending sparks racing toward the back fences of Grace's haven. Luke came running from the direction of the main barn, smoke already beginning to drift across the yard. "It's moving straight for us," he shouted. The smell of burning grass reached them a second later, sharp, hot, and terrifying. Then the horses began to panic. Inside the barns, hooves pounded against wood. Nervous cries rose into the night as the animals caught the scent of smoke and fire. A few started kicking at their stall doors hard enough to shake the walls. Ethan and Luke ran for the barn together. By the time they reached the main aisle, the air was already hazy. Horses tossed their heads violently, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. One gelding slammed his shoulder against the stall door with enough force to splinter the latch. "We have to move them now," Ethan said. There was no time to discuss a plan. They opened the first stall, then the next, moving quickly, but trying not to spread panic with their own fear. Luke grabbed lead ropes where he could, but soon there was no point pretending they could guide every horse one by one. The only chance was to get them all out and drive them toward the low ground near the creek, where the grass stayed greener and the fire might struggle to follow. Smoke thickened rapidly. It crawled into the barn aisle, and this stung Ethan's eyes until tears streamed down his face. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Behind the barn, he heard the crackle of flame reaching the rear fence line. A section of wood collapsed with a loud snap. The fire had reached the ranch. For a few desperate minutes, the entire place dissolved into noise and confusion, horses screaming, boards breaking wind, driving sparks into the dark. And then something strange happened. The young mares moved. Hope was the first. She burst from the side paddock and ran hard across the open yard. Not in blind panic, but with shocking purpose, angling toward the lower meadow beyond the barn. Her head was high, her ears forward, and she gave a sharp call over her shoulder as if pulling the others after her. Faith followed next, but instead of running straight on, she curved back through the scattering horses. She cut around a panicked gelding pressed close to a frightened rescue mare and drove them forward with the instinctive rhythm of a herd animal that somehow understood the job in front of her. Joy stayed near the barn. She paced in tight, agitated circles, close to the entrance, refusing to bolt, while the older horses were still coming out. Twice Ethan saw her turn back toward the smoke, as if trying to keep the weaker animals from breaking apart. Then Grace appeared. The great mare was older now, slower than her daughters, but there was still something commanding in the way she stepped into the yard. Her dark body seemed immense against the smoke and firelight. She did not rear or panic. She simply moved forward, steady, deliberate, and sure. The other horses fell in behind her. Not all at once, not cleanly, but clearly. Some obeyed Hope's movement, some responded to Faith's pressure, and some perhaps followed the older authority in Grace's stride. The herd began to flow toward the low ground near the creek in a rough but unmistakable order. Ethan stared for a moment through the smoke, barely believing what he was seeing. "They're organizing," Luke shouted, his voice hoarse. And somehow they were. Grace led the center of the herd with the calm gravity of a matriarch. Hope ran ahead, clearing the path. Faith circled and gathered stragglers. Joy hovered near the rear, staying close to the weaker rescues and refusing to leave them behind. It looked less like panic than survival written into blood. "Get to the creek," Ethan yelled, though by then the horses hardly needed the command. Once the main body of the herd had reached the lower meadow, Ethan and Luke turned back toward the flames. The rear edge of the ranch was burning hard now. Fire licked at the fence posts and ran along the dry grass toward the outer sheds. The heat hit Ethan's face in waves. They formed a frantic, exhausting rhythm, fill buckets from the storage tank, throw water on the hottest patches, stomp sparks into the dirt, drag burning brush away from the walls. Then headlights began to appear. People from Silver Creek had seen the glow from town. Tom Alvarez arrived first in his truck, followed by 2 ranchers with shovels and a water tank in the back. Then came more neighbors, some still pulling coats over their clothes, others half-dressed, all carrying whatever they had managed to grab. No one asked questions. They simply joined the fight. Men cut a wider fire break around the side of the barn. Women passed buckets and wet blankets. Luke and Ethan worked until their arms felt numb and their lungs burned from smoke. More than once, Ethan thought the fire was going to jump the line and swallow the whole place anyway. But slowly, painfully, inch by inch, the flames began to lose their edge. The wind shifted. The fire slowed. And sometime near dawn, after hours that felt like an entire lifetime, it stopped just short of the main barn. When morning finally broke, the sky above Silver Creek looked washed, pale, and exhausted. The field behind Grace's Haven was black. Charred grass stretched across the slope where the fire had run wild a few hours earlier. Fence posts smoked in the early light. The air still smelled of ash and wet dirt. But the ranch still stood. The barns were scarred and smoke-darkened, yet standing. The paddocks remained. The house, the sheds, the sanctuary itself, still there. Ethan walked down toward the creek, with his boots crunching through cinders and ash. The horses were gathered in the lower meadow, exactly where Grace had taken them. Some stood close together, still tense from the night. Others had already lowered their heads to the greener grass by the water. Hope stood alert at the front of the herd. Faith lingered near the rescues, as if still checking on them. Joy lifted her head and trotted toward Ethan the moment she saw him. And Grace stood near the stream, dark and still watching over all of them. Ethan stopped a few feet away from her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he laid a hand gently against her neck. "If you hadn't moved them," he whispered. He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. He knew. Everyone knew. If Grace had panicked, if the herd had scattered, if those precious minutes had been lost to chaos instead of instinct and leadership, Grace's Haven might have burned to the ground with half its animals trapped inside. By the time Ethan and Luke returned to town later that day for supplies, Silver Creek was already talking. At first, people said the sanctuary had survived because the town showed up in time. Then others corrected them. No, the town had helped save the buildings, but Grace had saved the horses. And soon people began saying something deeper. Grace was not just the horse Ethan rescued for $5. She was the horse who had rescued the ranch right back. From that day forward, Grace's Haven became more than a refuge for broken animals. It became part of Silver Creek's identity, a symbol of endurance and second chances, not just for the horses, but for the people who had started gathering around the place, as if it belonged to all of them. Another year passed, then another, and Grace's Haven grew far beyond anything Ethan Carter had imagined when he first led a starving mare into an old, half-falling barn. By the second year, the sanctuary had become a true rescue operation. More than 20 horses had been saved from abandonment and neglect or hard use. Luke Dawson managed the main barn, now keeping records, organizing feed deliveries, overseeing repairs, and training younger horses with a calm patience he had never known he possessed. Volunteers from neighboring towns began arriving on weekends, willing to muck stalls, repair fences, and help with whatever needed doing. School groups came too. Teachers from Silver Creek and nearby communities brought children to the ranch for day visits. The kids learned how to approach a horse quietly, how to hold out a flat palm with feed, how to brush a coat without startling the animal beneath it. Hope was the favorite. She had grown into a beautiful young mare with a soft, intelligent face and a patience that seemed endless. She stood quietly for children, lowering her head so they could stroke her nose or run small hands through her mane. Faith had become something different, calmer, steadier, deeply sensitive to the emotions of the herd. She always seemed to know when one of the rescues was frightened, and she often stood close to nervous newcomers until they settled. Joy was the strongest of the three, the fastest runner on the prairie, all power and sunlight and bold spirit. As for Luke, the ranch changed him too. The years he had carried inside him from the military, the sleeplessness, the heaviness, the memories he never quite named, began to loosen their hold. Work gave his body purpose. The horses gave his mind something quieter to return to. One evening, while he and Ethan leaned on the corral fence, watching the herd settle in for the night, Luke said, "You know, I came here thinking I was helping save horses." Ethan glanced at him. Luke gave a small smile. "Turns out this place saved me too." Ethan didn't answer right away. Then he nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know the feeling." Not long after that, William Harrington returned. This time he arrived without the energy of a buyer and without the hard edge of business in his voice. He spent a long time walking the property, watching the horses, studying hope, faith, and joy as they moved across the pasture. When he finally spoke to Ethan, his proposal was different. "I'm not here to take them from you," Harrington said. "I'm here because their bloodline matters. Grace's line could help preserve the Shire breed in this country." He explained that the breed was shrinking, that true foundation lines were disappearing, and that hope, faith, and joy represented something rare enough to shape the future of those horses for generations. "I want to help make Grace's Haven a preservation center," he said, "not just a rescue." Ethan looked out over the pasture before answering. He thought of the auction yard, the storm, the fire, everything that had happened because of one broken mare nobody wanted. Then he looked back at Harrington. "They stay here," Ethan said. Harrington nodded. They stay here. That was the only condition Ethan ever needed. By then, Grace was older. She moved more slowly now, especially in the mornings. Sometimes she stood near the fence a little longer before joining the herd. Her steps had lost some of the strength they once held. But no one in Silver Creek failed to notice when she passed. People spoke more softly around her. Children who visited the ranch were often told, "That's Grace, the $5 mare who changed this valley." And they would look at her with wide eyes, as if staring at something larger than a horse. One evening late in summer, Ethan stood against the old wooden fence and watched the herd run under a sky turning gold with sunset. Hope, faith, and joy led the movement, their strong young bodies flashing through the grass. Behind them, the rest of the rescued horses followed in a loose, flowing line across the field. Grace stood farther back, outlined by the fading light. Ethan's hands rested on the fence rail as memory moved through him. He saw again the dust of the auction yard, the laughter of men who thought he was a fool, the feel of $5 crumpled in his hand. He remembered believing he was making one small, reckless choice to spare a dying horse a cruel end. He could never have guessed that choice would lead here. To the sanctuary, to Luke, to the rescued horses, to the children laughing in the paddocks, to hope, faith, and joy racing through the golden grass, to a life that had somehow become full again. As the last sunlight faded over the Wyoming prairie, Ethan smiled to himself and looked toward Grace one more time. Grace's haven was no longer just a ranch. It was a place where abandoned lives were given back their meaning. A place where broken things were not discarded, but restored. And all of it, every fence, every foal, every healed horse and healed heart, had begun with the simplest act imaginable. A poor cowboy, $5, and a dying mare the world had already given up on. Thank you so much for spending time with this story and being part of our community. Your support means a lot to us. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel and feel free to share it with someone who loves powerful animal stories too. See you in the next one.